Okay, this is video number 2 of chapter 4 in the Manipulated Mind by Denise Wynn, Conditioning. Another couple of findings from Pavlov's laboratory are worth studying before going on to see how conditioned responses of their various kinds can play a role, often unconscious in ordinary human behavior, and how our knowledge of conditioned responses can be used to shape behavior. Pavlov found that a dog which was conditioned to salivate on hearing a particular tone struck by the tuning fork also usually responded by salivating when it heard a tone that was either higher or lower than the original one it had learned by. Pavlov called this generalization. Again, it is a phenomenon familiar in life. A woman who is attacked by a man when walking alone at night down a street may well come to fear any man who looms into view on any subsequent occasion when she is alone at night in the street. But Pavlov's dogs also showed the power to discriminate. A tone that was considerably higher or considerably lower than the original tone they had paired with food elicited far less salivation than one that was closer. One of Pavlov's students found that discrimination could itself be conditioned. Using cards that showed a circle followed by food as a conditioned stimulus to trigger salivation, she found that the dogs would also salivate if she showed them cards with an ellipse. In other words, generalization occurred. Then she set about teaching them to distinguish between a circle and an ellipse by giving them food only after she had shown a circle but not after she had shown an ellipse. Once the dogs had caught on and only salivated to the circle, she proceeded to test how far their discriminative powers could go. She started showing them cards with ellipses that looked more and more like circles until finally the dogs failed to discriminate between them at all. What was most interesting, however, was what happened to the dogs while they were undergoing this experience. One dog that Pavlov described started wiggling about in his experimental stand, tried to bite off the apparatus tubes, and then, when taken out, began to bark violently and generally displayed all the symptoms of neurosis. Later testing showed that it could no longer discriminate even between simple circles and ellipses. What had happened was that the stress of trying to discriminate between food and non-food signals, the circle and the ellipse, was too much for the dog. It was from here that Pavlov went on to study the neurosis that could be induced by giving a dog conflicting signals which threw it into confusion. These findings were outlined in Chapter 2. Pavlov's interest was to see how stress reactions affected conditioned learning. But it is relevant here to consider the Chinese communists' tactics of switching from kindness to cruelty, or the giving or withholding of rewards. They were inducing confusion and stress in prisoners by preventing them from learning to adapt to expected behavior. As we shall see, conditioning, which is a vital and natural form of learning that helps us function in our environment, can become utterly disabling when it is maladaptive. The conditioning of fear and anxiety, for instance, can be both adaptive and maladaptive, in other words, useful or disabling. A child who touches a boiling kettle and gets burned will learn not to touch boiling kettles again. A child who, having been burned by a boiling kettle, generalizes its fear to all kettles, even when cold, has learned a response which ceases to be useful. American psychologist John Watson is famous for his experiments in conditioning fear. He was an ardent enthusiast of Pavlov's ideas and is considered the father of behaviorism because he maintained that all behavior, however complicated, is the result of learned responses to different stimuli. He thought that if one could find exactly which stimuli elicited which response, all the complexities of human behavior would be unraveled, without any need to get bogged down in unmeasurables like ideas and emotions. In an experiment to show that emotions are only the result of simple conditioning, he set about to instill in a little boy called Albert a fear of white rats. Having given Albert an appealing little white rat to play with, which the child liked, Watson then started hitting a steel bar with a hammer every time Albert touched the rat. Startled by the noise, Albert soon learned to associate white rats with terrifying sudden sounds and developed a fear of the white rat. The indefatigable Watson then proceeded to torture the child more. No, I'm kidding. The indefatigable Watson then proceeded to proved that Albert's fear had generalized to white furry objects, as he was just as frightened by the sight of a white fur coat and even Santa Claus whiskers. Nothing like these psychologists torturing children to unlock the secrets of the mind, right? Oh man. Fear, however, is not a reflex action. It is a protective response that gets the body ready to react to a frightening or threatening situation. While Watson could show that it was just as easy to condition such emotional responses as it was to condition reflex actions such as salivation, he found that emotional responses were not anywhere near as easy to extinguish. Ceasing to use the hammer, even verbal reassurance to Albert that the rat was harmless and did nothing to reduce the boy's fear. Now imagine a child having fear like that of a rat. If anybody you guys have read 1984, and then when Winston was in the Ministry of Love, and what was Room 101? Your worst fear, right? And they threatened with putting that cage around his head that had like a rat. They released the rats, and the rats were like starving, and they would like attack his face. Man, I'll tell you. All right. Conditioning that is maladaptive to our environment is not only produced by experimenters in laboratories with hypotheses to prove. Our experiences throughout life affect the way we adapt to all similar and not so similar situations. A man whose first two girlfriends were much more intelligent than he, and who therefore made him feel uncomfortable, inadequate, and anxious when he was with them, may learn to avoid two intelligent women in the future, or he may generalize his fear and start feeling anxious in the presence of all women. Oh, man. Whether emotionally involved with them or not, the latter response is patently maladaptive. Watson thought that classical conditioning was the be-all and end-all of human behavior. He was wrong in that. Certainly, emotional responses to environmental stresses can be affected by many factors other than the particular stress itself. A psychologist called Liddell from Cornell University spent 30 years studying experimental neurosis, which is what had been induced in the dogs who couldn't discriminate between ellipses and circles. In one experiment in the 1950s, he exposed a mother sheep and her twin lambs to inescapable electric shocks. Oh man, what a way to make a living. The mother and one lamb were in one room, the twin lamb in another on its own. And I got to stop it right there so we don't run out of time. All right, make a little mark. All right, so we're going to pick this up in the next video. This was video number 2 in chapter 4, and we will pick up with video number 3. We are reading from The Manipulated Mind by Denise Wynn. Don't go away. Stay tuned.